Are you a Republican or a Democrat or a donkey or an elephant? Who's gonna win? Trump or Kamala? I don't know. I don't have a vote. I'm not a US citizen. But what is funny is that in my native country, Kamala means horrible in Finnish. I'm not even joking. You can Google it. As you can probably tell from my accent, and if you've been following this channel, I'm not American.
What?
I am from Europe. I'm from Finland, actually. And right now, this is the election season. Maybe you'll watch this video after the election, so you'll be wiser what happened. But right now, there's a big presidential election in the US, which inspired me to make a video about the differences of politics, but also elections in the US versus Europe. And hi, if you're new to the channel, my name is Tero. I am from Finland and I'm a fungi-loving entrepreneur. I'm a founder of these mushroom companies. I've written multiple books on mushrooms and I've lived in 10 countries, 5 of them being in Europe. And for the last decade, I've been living in the US. I'm not a US citizen, so I don't get to vote in US elections. So I always think it's funny just looking at the battles of Republicans and Democrats as kind of like an outsider looking in. And I have some thoughts on how the US could get better, but also some critiques of the European system. It's not perfect either. So in this video, I'm going to talk about it. If you're interested in the cultural differences of politics and elections between the two regions, this video is for you. By the way, I think this video will be helpful even if you're not super political. I wouldn't call myself very political, but it does impact all of us, and I think it's hard to escape it. So having better understanding of it is helpful to anyone. It's kind of like economics, like Econ 101 is very helpful to everyone, even if you don't work in economics or finance, just to understand that how demand and supply and interest rates work. And because it does, even if you don't want it, it will impact your life. Politics is one of those topics where they say that in the US you should never talk about it, which I think is like kind of weird, because how is it going to ever get better if there isn't communication around it, unemotional communication? There's a lot of fighting going on. And at the same time, if you talk to a lot of Americans from both sides of the aisle and just everyday Americans, I feel like a lot of them point that the issues in America are due to politicians and educational systems. So if those are the two big problems America faces, we should probably talk about those and see how can we get better. In Europe, I've lived in Finland, UK, France, Switzerland, and Italy. And they all have slightly different systems, but there's also a lot of similarities between the systems. So when I talk about Europe, I'm mostly talking about European Union, but Europe is also a geographic and a cultural concept that includes things like Russia and Turkey. In this case, I'm mostly focused on what people call the Western Europe and Central Europe and European Union and the US overall. And I think what's similar about the both systems is that there's like this federal level, think of in Europe, the European Union, and then there's the states, in this case, the countries. And those two systems overlap, but there is this idea of like federal elections and then state elections and state decisions versus federal decisions. And the same concept is in Europe. You have the countries making certain decisions, but at the end of the day, the European Union make the final call. And there's a lot of fighting on that as well. And sometimes the state and federal incentives are different, same way as in Europe. In Europe, you might think like, oh, there's the king and the queen and the this and that, the monarchies, but a lot of those people don't have power, including also presidents. Like if you think of like presidents of different countries, they might be a lot in media. Their job is to go around and travel to G8 conferences or whatnot, but they don't really make the decisions. It's usually the prime minister that makes the decisions. And I think there's also that somewhat similarity between the US system where a lot of the power doesn't lie on the president, but the president is a bellwether to the culture and kind of direction and narrative of the country. And foreign politics is a big part of that. But at the end of the day, you need the parliaments, or in the US case, the House and the Senate, to make the decisions. By the way, I've studied a little bit of political science, but I'm not going to act like I'm an expert. But I think a lot of voters don't care about that level of detail. They care about just from their vantage point, and this is what the video is about. It's about from like a voter's or a citizen's point of view, what are the differences, pros and cons between the two regions? The biggest difference to me between the two regions politically is the party system. US is donkeys and elephants. So you basically have two parties, two-party system. Now, someone will argue that it's not, there's other parties, but really there's just two parties that can win. In those cases, you have kind of like historically center left and center right. And in Europe, you historically had three parties. You had center left, center, and center right, and they would rotate. Not that different originally, but then Europe, you had legit other parties. So there could be another 10 parties, but definitely there was a green party and a far left and a far right party always existed. Maybe they were like in minority. But what this means from an election point of view and political point of view is that there was no one winner even on the parliament level. In order to control the parliament in the US, you need a majority. So then either Democrats or Republicans would have majority. In Europe, when there was three parties, and I'll get back to that in a second, now more commonly 5 parties that are somewhat bigger, no party ever gets 50%. Like if you get 30%, you crushed it. You might have first dibs on like the prime minister and to form a coalition for the majority, but you don't necessarily get to win. And this is actually happening right now in France as we're filming this, where the winner is getting blocked out of the coalition because nobody wants to partner with them and they don't have 50%. And in order to pass anything, you need to have more than 50%. So in this case, those parties would do deals with each other. But what happened, I'll use Finland as an example, where you had center left, center right parties. Initially, they were kind of far apart. You got the workers here and the capitalists here, and the farmers were the center party historically. And you always needed 2 of them to make the party. And then one of them was be in opposition and critique everything they did. What happens is often, like if you're in power for a long enough time, the main party, the ruling party, would become unpopular because citizens would be like, I don't like this shit, so let's get rid of them. So often the leading party would move into the opposition in the election. The runner-up party would become the main party, and the opposition party would become the runner-up party, and the circle would go around and round and round and round. Sadly, after it had happened a few times, the opposition was less critical of the 2 other parties because they knew at the next election they had to partner with one of them. So they actually became closer and closer. I believe the Overton window got narrower and narrower would be the official term. So in the last few years around Europe, the far right and far left have created this havoc in this political system where there's now 5 major parties. I don't think US needs 5 parties, but it surely would be nice to have 3, I think ideally 4. At least you could choose, like, if you're fiscally conservative, fiscally liberal, and socially conservative, socially liberal, and it would create a 2x2, and you could choose a party that would match your fiscal and social preferences at some scale. But in the US, you don't have that. And I think that ends up often having elections where there's 2 bad candidates. I think that's probably the case in this right now. Citizens feel like, isn't there better choices for these roles? But in Europe, there is more fighting, but then the coalition becomes very political. So after the election, the winner doesn't always get to make the final coalition. So as a summary, US has 2 parties. Europe now used to be 3 big parties, a bunch of small ones. Now it tends to be 5 big parties and at various degrees, which makes awesome because as a voter, you have more choices, but sometimes post-election, even the winners don't get to form it. I think eventually it's gonna bite the other parties in the butt, but at the end of the day, I think that's the big difference. And in the US, I just hope that there would be more options for American citizens to vote on and more options in both in politics or capitalism. More choices is better for the consumer or citizen, and I think just having options is always a good thing. The other thing that's quite different in Europe overall versus the US overall is that in the US, the individual has more rights. So it's like there's more freedom. I think if there's like one overarching theme about America, it's freedom, at least the aspiration for that freedom. Overall, like it's very freedom oriented, very capitalistically oriented, versus Europe is more socially oriented. And there's pros and cons. So as citizens, I would say generally Americans have the political system allows for more freedom of choice between more in like state level decisions, but also in your community and as an individual, versus in Europe, there's more regulation and that slows down business and innovation. But at the same time, you have more social welfare benefits that you wouldn't necessarily get in the US. You probably know this from my past videos that I've made around work culture and parenting and living between these 2 regions. But there is definitely more welfare and benefits in the political systems, even in the more right-oriented parties give more benefits to people that in the US, almost the left-leaning tend to give. Some examples of the freedom could be like the right to own a gun, or hate speech, or internet related social media rights of what can you do, what can you not do. And in the US, I feel like a lot of that is more lax. Like you can have a gun, you can say, you have freedom of speech, freedom of doing stuff. In Europe, if you say the wrong thing or have the wrong thing, you get arrested a lot easier. You saw this with COVID, but in general, like so many things are just not allowed, and it's almost easier to get to jail there for doing something weird. Another example of that could be the big tech companies. European Union has been cracking down on the big tech really hard, like starting with the Microsoft stuff a long time ago, but now around Google and this and that. In general, political system is more focused on freedom of the individual in the US, and in Europe, more about the democracy. At the end of the day, US in a way is not based on democracy. It's a republic. So you elect someone to represent you, versus Europe at least tries to be on paper, try to be like, hey, the majority decides what happens. So 51% can decide what the 49% have to also do. American politicians are often said to be crooked and corrupt. And this is, I think, one of those things that people who haven't lived in both regions don't understand, but it happens maybe more in Europe. You would think that in Europe, because of the multiple parties and situations, there would be less corruption. But overall, European Union is famous for so many political scandals. I mean, if you want to look at people like Silvio Berlusconi, I mean, that's like just the classic. There's a lot of other examples as well. So I don't think corruption in the US is any greater than it is in Europe. I think they're comparable. It just might be a little different. I think the financing and campaign ads are very different. So in Europe, there's a lot more strict regulation who can give you money and lobby for you, and how the ads are a little more policy focused and professional. Versus US, there's always like campaigns around your like opposing folks, and they talk really mean stuff, and there's billionaires giving money to fund certain people. And that I feel like happens a lot less in Europe. Obviously it does happen, but it's more around policies and actually campaigning. It's still expensive to run for government in, I think, any country, but in the US, the numbers are just astronomical compared to Europe. One other thing that is interestingly different, even though it technically should be the same, is immigration. So historically, America was known as the melting pot of the world, particularly if you think of like places like New York, where everybody from around the world would come and immigrants were welcomed, I guess on paper. I don't know if in Ellis Island everybody was welcome, but you get the idea. In Europe, it is also a melting pot because like it's so multicultural as a starting point, and you would think that it's very welcoming to immigrants. But the big difference is that US is more cohesive in this regard. It's more on the federal level. So either the border and immigration policy is strict, versus in Europe, it varies by country a lot. When I lived in Switzerland, they were very anti-immigration, and I think they still are. And in certain countries like Sweden, people are very lax about it. Finland was always like more on the strict side with immigration. But then where you're within the European Union, you can almost go anywhere. So that's kind of the loophole there. Overall, the decision was more in the country level, versus in the US, the decision is not on the state level, it's on the federal level. And that frustrates certain states that are more strict on immigration, and then it's led by maybe some other folks that are maybe looser on the immigration. Europeans are also more environmentally focused within policy. So if you're into politics, environmental factors, and the power of the Green Party or Green Movement is much bigger in Europe. I think California is probably a state closer to the European system. But that's another big kind of difference, is that in the US, you often talk about economy, employment, immigration, wars, and like personal scandals or personal rhetorical abilities. And in Europe, there is definitely more discussion around welfare and environmental values. My second to last difference between the two regions is actually voter turnout. And it's almost bigger than the voter turnout. It's culturally. In my video about the work differences between the US and Europe, you can check it out below. I talked a lot about how in water cooler conversations, you are almost encouraged to talk politics and debate people. Versus in the US, like it's not often kosher, at least in the business environment, to talk about politics. That's very like hush hush, and a lot of people are not open, and there's not a peaceful debate often. So people avoid that topic because they don't want to bring it up just to like offend someone. Versus in Europe, it's more common to have these debates. But because you have maybe these debates and a culture of like battling over political ideas, in France, it's even like riots commonly when I lived in Paris. I would almost every week or every 2 weeks, I would see a new riot somewhere. But that leads to voter turnout. In the US, presidential elections are by far the most popular overall, and you get like 50-60% turnout. Like if 50% of the nation votes on the president, that means like half the people were not engaged. And then in the midterm elections, the voter turnout is even less. And in Europe, obviously varies a lot by country and type of election, but tends to be more in the 70% range. And that just means like more of the people get to say their vote. Now, you could argue that you shouldn't vote because if you think the political system is so corrupt that it's not worth fixing or it's too hard to fix, drain the swamp, then you probably just need to get out of the system. And that's how I feel like most Americans are. A lot of people are just disengaged with the whole thing. They've been frustrated, they've been burned, they've trusted in the past, but they can't trust anymore. So I think more and more Americans are just like not believers of the political system at all. And I think that shows the rise and popularity of certain political figures that are very anti-political, almost, like including obviously Donald Trump. The traditional politicians are doing worse and non-traditional politicians are doing better because people are just like, they don't like the system and the politicians. I'm not saying politicians are popular in Europe, but there's maybe more respect and they sometimes do get more heat because of this common debate culture. My last difference between the two regions is just how you get the election results. I often think of the George W. Bush, Al Gore election. I was like old enough to remember it, but young enough that I didn't know much either. And I remember the results kept dragging for like a long time after the election had passed. And they were like finding votes in like bathrooms or something. And my dad said at that point is like, oh, this is like how banana republics work. I thought that was weird because America is the most like progressive and technologically advanced country that I knew. Is like how there isn't a better system in the US. And now that I've lived here longer, I've seen it happen where the voting system is really weird and unclear. The whole point about the electoral college is hard to understand. And like a bunch of the states don't even matter. And only these like few states matter, and how they count the votes is different. But somehow in many of these places, it takes like 1 to 2 weeks to count the votes. And I was like, how is that possible with all this money spent on ads? How can they not be counted within 24 hours or sooner? In Europe, there is mailing ballots, there's other things, but at least you usually get the results that day, that night. And almost always in elections, it's confirmed by like midnight or something like that. And in the US, it drags along. And I think in the last few elections, we've seen it drag along even longer, and there's court cases and this and that. I think that's a big difference from a not expert political science person, is like, what shady stuff happens behind the closed doors. And this is not an attack on either party or any political campaign. I'm sure it's on both sides of the aisle. But at the end of the day, in Europe, you do get the results pretty much that day. And here you just have to wait. And there's like all kinds of drama, whoever wins. That's it. If you're an expert in political science, leave an expert comment below on the other differences. These were the main differences I've noticed as an amateur and just living in Europe and in the US and observing it from outside looking in. I don't have a horse in the race in this election. I do hope there would be more political parties in the US. Having more options would be great. And at the same time, I think Europe has gone too far on limiting innovation and growth of companies. And I think it's showing up on the scoreboard. I think more rights and freedom in Europe would probably serve everyone better. So I think both regions have their pros and cons as always. Whatever happens in this election, I hope people will be less hostile and angry at each other. And I think love at the end of the day wins. Anyway, this was another video in my series of US versus Europe. You can check out a few of the other ones below or somewhere on the side. I don't know where they are. But if you like the content, like and subscribe to the channel. If you have critiques of it, leave a comment below. I will not be offended. I will not take it personally. That's okay. And I hope to see you in one of my other videos published before or after this. Thank you. Bye.